So hi everyone, welcome to the Heroes of Data Roundtable. It's your hosts as per usual. It's myself and Yi. Really nice to be here. And with us today, we have a very special guest calling in all the way from the US. It's Matt Weingarten. Do you want to introduce yourself, Matt?
Yeah, so thank you for having me here, Sarah. So I've been a fan of, Validio's content for a while now, so I'm happy to be a part of the Heroes of Data. For my background, I am currently a data engineer over at Disney Streaming. I've been there for about 2 years. Before that, I was a data engineer at what is now Meta, but was previously Facebook, and I got my start at Nielsen. So I've always been in the data space throughout my career, and I've gotten to see how much it's just evolved in this time frame. And I'm really am a fan of like the age that we're at right now with data engineering. It's just continuously evolving, and there's a lot of challenges that arise with that are worthy of discussion like this.
Yeah, we're super happy to have you, and you have a very impressive background. I just said that we were prepping now for the call. And when did we first start collaborating together and kind of writing content? Must have been almost like a year
Yeah, I
ago.
think it was like, it wasn't a year ago. It was, I think, back in September or
Yeah,
October. We
okay.
wrote a series together about data quality. Now Validio has switched over to the realm of deep data observability, but
Yeah.
still a lot of the data quality challenges are relevant today.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, it's been great working together actually, and also great to have you in this setting too. A little bit more kind of community Heroes of Data, so really, really fun. And speaking of quality, I think that's actually a nice segue into the topic that we wanted to discuss with you, Matt. Yeah, I see you're starting to get excited. Do you want to kind of introduce us, kick us off, what we're going to talk about?
I wanted to say segue, but yeah, that's an
Yeah.
awesome segue because today we're going to talk about data and quality, although not maybe data quality in the sense that we usually think about it. Today's topic is still not worded properly, but loosely, how organizations can meet the quality issues and that arise from the use of the modern data mesh, basically. So we've seen the rise of the data mesh, obviously, over the past few months, and a lot of discussion has been had about how to solve ownership issues and also data quality issues with, for example, data contracts and so forth. But we have noticed that not everyone in the world works at, for example, Netflix, and most teams are a bit smaller and perhaps not always, equipped to handle the cross-functional challenges that arise with the use of the data mesh. So for our first question of the day for you, Matt, would be, do you agree that there is a quality ghost haunting the modern data mesh? Have you seen that?
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say if I would just pin that to data mesh entirely. I feel like overall there's definitely a data quality issue throughout our data world. I feel like data is prevalent everywhere now. We're dealing with petabytes of data on a daily basis, if not more in some areas. And, we're creating all these jobs and processes to handle ingesting that and processing it to where it needs to be for its next use case. But we're not necessarily prioritizing quality as one of the chief concerns. And, for a lot of the data that's out there, there's a lot of common sources of error that can just lead to quality issues. And we're not necessarily doing the proper accounting for it. So, I mean, that's definitely a chief concern, I feel. We've seen the reports about how much quality issues can actually cost companies. I think on the range of millions of dollars per year if it's not taken into account. So it's definitely a chief concern no matter what type of architecture is behind, that whole system.
So architecture is a good keyword here. What we're thinking about, or what I'm thinking about here, is stuff like if you have a team and they are expected to produce, expose data of some sort, but then you have, for instance, a performance issue because possibly you have poor architecture, and that can be traced back to the team simply being small and not having the cross-functional expertise to, for instance, write DBT architecture that isn't spaghetti and so forth. And I feel, at least, that the decentralized nature of the data mesh kind of exacerbates this problem a little bit. We don't want a central data team. We don't want high and mighty data engineers to descend on the teams and say, oh, you have to do it this way. You have to follow standard software engineering practices. But at the same time, for smaller organizations, such as Disney, obviously, it can be difficult to ensure that you have the expertise in every single team. What's your comment on that?
Yeah, I agree. You know, with this decentralized architecture that the data mesh has at its core, you know, for like central tools, you know, that would exist in other you know, organizations, things like data quality and the like, you know, what happens is, you know, there's like a skill gap between all the different teams. It's not like every single team is going to be the same way. So as a result of that, you know, some teams will have properly accounted for data quality, but others, you know, just are dealing with all these other issues, and that doesn't become a chief concern for them. So there becomes a disconnect as a result. And then some areas of the, you know, organization are taking it into account while others are lagging behind. So the whole thing and the challenge that we need to figure out is how can we kind of unify this together without going beyond what we would want to do with a data mesh and solve the quality issues while keeping to the key core principles that we'd have behind that.
So would you say that having a data mesh, I lost track of my question, I guess. Would you say that having a data mesh and decentralizing, as you say, you have a skill gap, you've decentralized the architecture. If you want to bring that back together, basically, essentially, what you want to avoid with the data mesh is to have this centralized bottleneck, right? You don't want everything to go past the PR review gods. You want for that to be spread out evenly across the teams. But how would you say that you could set up a strategy for an organization to kind of meet that problem?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I mean, you know, this is like one of the core underlying things that you have to figure out. You know, we want to be decentralized, but at the end of the day, there are some like key components like data quality, infrastructure automation, and so on and so forth that, you know, you would have these platform teams solve that. If you're going to move away from that, then how are you going to be properly handling that? So I think maybe that there still needs to be like some you know, core like principles, or at least a rough outline of how things should be done within each of the different like domains that the data mesh is broken down into. And then it would be reliant upon, you know, some people that at least make sure that's in place, because what happens if you don't have that and then it's just a free-for-all is you just kind of turn into this complete mess where some areas are up and running as you would expect, and then others are way behind. And then, you know, data mesh becomes more of a data mess than anything.
Right. That's a good
Yeah.
catchphrase.
Yeah.
Would you say that it's fair to say that we want to move then from centralized data architect teams to centralized data policing teams?
I feel like that's probably the best way to handle it, because at the end of the day, you know, you just can't reasonably expect, you know, each and every application team to be able to do these things themselves. You know, there's from a prioritization perspective, I feel like some teams don't necessarily recognize the need for proper data quality, while others do. And so you need to have that kind of like that policing / platform team in place to help bring down some of those tools. So at least you can work with them and integrate that to have that in place.
That's very interesting. I have a question then. So basically what we're discussing here is, you know, you should have some things centrally decided, and then you should have some things kind of organized by the different domains. Where do you draw that line? Like, what things go in the centrally decided / policed group, and what things should be kind of free for all, or like the domain decides themselves? Because
yeah, and
I feel like that's a big discussion, and like what factors should influence that. But let's start with like how you split it.
Yeah, and that's a great question, because I think, you know, figuring out the answer to that question is kind of like walking a fine line, because you know, there's no perfect answer to that. And, you know, infringing upon one will lead to like a breakdown in the other. Like if you put too much in that centralized bucket, then you're not necessarily adhering to the principles of a data mesh. So you kind of have to figure out what are the core things that should be there, so that you're at least adhering to that, while at least making sure that you have that proper policing in place. I think data quality is probably one that should fall into that bucket, just because I think you need to have like a central team that's at least putting some platform in place. Now that platform should be rather configurable. It shouldn't be like every single team needs to integrate it to these same principles, but it should at least be flexible enough so that teams can roll into that as necessary. So I think that's one thing. I mean, there's a bunch of other ones that would fall into that bucket as well, but you definitely have to and it's definitely worth that conversation to make sure that you have that proper separation in place. So at least each of the domains can still do what they need to do without being bottlenecked by having too much of a reliance on that centralized platform.
Yeah, cool. And Matt, I know you've worked in various different organizations and you have a lot of experience from different setups. Have you been in or do you have examples of this discussion taking place from any of those experiences that you have about like, oh, who should decide this, and like, does it go with the function / domain, or that type of discussion? How did it, and if so, how did it?
And I feel like that's actually one of the things that we're kind of getting our feet wet and trying to figure out right now. So I mean, Disney is, I don't think I need to provide too much context. Disney is a huge organization, when you think about all the different areas it represents, it's gigantic. And what comes along with that is sometimes we fall into the trap of having some silos in place between different areas of the organization. Like, your typical Disney media entities could be separated from the rest of like the Disney streaming side of the business, which is more new because that's just kind of been a recent emergence into the ecosystem. So what comes along with that is each of these teams, they might individually start on their own and set up some of this. And then when you try to merge these areas together, you have all this clash of, okay, what are we going to take from one and put in the other? How can we reconcile this, or do we keep it separate? And then that becomes, a whole discussion of how we can sort this out. Application teams need to be involved. They're like, well, we can't do this. It's currently set up like this. We want to adhere to this. And it's, our platform team has to figure out what is the best way to handle that. Sometimes it's just like, what's the least of all the evils that are there. So it's definitely a challenge. To provide some more experience, like when I was at Facebook, I feel like Facebook already had this handled, or maybe it was just because Facebook is kind of like this giant monolith where everything kind of just falls into the same thing. Like Facebook doesn't have as many divisions. It was really just everything within Facebook, everything within Instagram, and so on and so forth. And for that, there was a very coherent platform. It was also just extremely well built, and you could just pretty easily plug into it as necessary, and then everything would work. But for other organizations that have some of the more silos in place, it's a lot more difficult to figure out.
Right. Would you say that it's fair to make the statement that when you try to decentralize responsibility and hand out ownership, across the organization, that some obfuscation of that the responsibilities also occurs? That it's suddenly not as clear cut. If you have a central data team, it's pretty easy to understand who decides everything. But then as soon as you try to spread that out, these kind of, I'm not going to say conflicts, but these kind of divides happen.
Oh yeah, all the time. I think there's this kind of like game of chicken that emerges sometimes when some of these things come up, where you're like, okay, we've recognized this now. Should this be taken centrally? Should we start to develop something ourselves? And you kind of just have to figure out where that belongs. And then sometimes you're like, well, this doesn't really belong to us, although I recognize it's a chief concern. Let me bring this to the platform team. And then the platform team's like, that makes sense, but here's all our priorities. This probably won't get into the backlog for X amount of time. And then you just end up shaking your head because, that's kind of where it is. But yes, that does happen all the time. And I don't really know if there's a great solution to that. I think it's just kind of maybe one of the things that really pops up in this whole data mesh system that we've put ourselves into, but it's definitely something that happens all the time.
Yeah, and depends a little bit on the severity of the incident that sparks the discussion.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And on the business priorities also, I guess. Like what is, you mentioned, Matt, like the platform team might have this backlog. and it might be influenced by things outside of the data teams and what they want to do. And do you, and actually, while I hear us discussing here, I have sort of I want to raise kind of the elephant in the room. And this is a question to both of you. Have you worked in an organization that actually is using data mesh?
I feel like, yeah, I feel like we're trying to now. I don't know if we're like 100% of the way to what the data mesh is envisioned to be, but at least I can say that we're trying to get there. If we aren't already, you know, part of the way through the journey. I think any of my previous experience, you know, this whole data mesh term that's exploded in the last few years wasn't there. So maybe we were doing it without recognizing it, but it feels like now it's just become this huge buzzword that everybody's really trying to buy into.
Yeah, I'll agree to that. And striving towards the data mesh, there are all these issues of interpretation of it that come along with it. Like, how dogmatic are you going to be? How purist and pedantic do you want to be about this definition? And that's kind of what sparked this topic, right? To begin with, when we figured, oh, we should ask Matt about these things, is striving towards the data mesh. I'm taking notes, striving towards the data mesh, and just simply realizing that, oh, so-and-so team haven't been asked if they want to do this. So-and-so team does not feel equipped to do this, but now they're tasked to do it. And another thing that I also wanted to ask about that kind of ties into that is the expectations from the business side. And as you say, Matt, this is kind of a buzzword right now, but I feel as though it's not super clear to everyone what value this is supposed to provide. Like, the way that I see it, data mesh solves this issue of a bottlenecking central data team, which is, you know, just one or two people sweating and crying and drinking bourbon in the morning. And like, we solve that problem. But then I come across stakeholders that can ask me, like, why are costs going up? Because they just, for whatever reason, assumed that this would be a cost-cutting measure, because they like cutting costs, and there's a buzzword, and they put those together. And I don't necessarily think the data mesh will reduce any costs. I don't think that's what it's supposed to do.
No, I don't think that's at the core of what it's supposed to do either. And I think, you know, I think this happens not just with data mesh, but a lot of the, you know, buzzwords that pop up in our industry. You know, I think when they first really start to emerge, there's all this hype around them, and everybody's like, okay, it's kind of like stocks. You know, something emerges and everybody's like, okay, we got to buy.
Bitcoin.
But they don't necessarily, you know, it's basically that at its core. So, you know, everybody gets on the train, but they don't necessarily do the proper like understanding of what this means and take a step back and figure out what that's actually going to look like and what the impact of that could be. So then you start to build to something, and then you're like, oh wait, now you're kind of like stuck, and then you got to figure out how you can reconcile this. Whether you start all over or you just put some hacky solution into place in order to accomplish that. So I think sometimes it's a lack of planning more than anything that could cause some of these issues.
Yeah, Sara is big on crystallizing business value of the propositions.
Exactly. And I'm actually I'm thinking about something. I have many thoughts, but one of them is, because I think one of the kind of theories that you are, you know, a proponent of is that you need to be a quite big organization before you even consider data mesh. Otherwise, you will spread your talent too thin or too thinly.
Yes.
And that's interesting, because what it means is that startups cannot have data mesh to begin with, because they will be too small. So every single organization will need to implement data mesh. Like, you're not going to have data mesh to begin with. So, and it seems like everybody is transitioning. Even if you are a new company, you don't have any type of legacy or, you know, any sort of like digital transformation that you need to do. You're not going to be born with data mesh. So everybody is and maybe that's why we haven't like fully solved it, because it's not possible to do it like right, so to speak, to begin with.
Yeah, but then, I mean, if we go back to the previous buzzword, if we just close our eyes and imagine that it's 2022, you know, the distant past, obviously, then the previous buzzword was data lake. That was another architecture, and that was supremely suited for a startup, a small startup. And I've still never seen a data lake in real life. Like I've
You
only
haven't?
no, not really. I've seen the architecture, and I've seen things that were espoused as data lakes, like, oh, this is our data lake, and it was like, yeah, that's your data warehouse that you fit things to, kind of. But I've still never seen an actually fully fledged working, this is so great because it's a data lake structure. Not in the wild. Have you, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, and I mean, well, it was data lake then, now it's data lake house, you know, that's the one too,
Yeah.
because they're like, oh, we actually need some of the warehouse principles in place, and you know, that's what Databricks prides themselves on, amongst other things. So yeah, I think that's totally the case. You know, everybody's like so wanting to cling on to these buzzwords that they'll be like, okay, look at what we did. And then, you know, some people and some the critics can be like, well, did you actually accomplish everything that it set out to? And then you're like, oh, wait. And then you got to kind of like get back to the drawing board. But to expand on Sarah's point about like the size of the organization, I think another key point, and this is actually something I've heard in talks before, it actually depends on how mature I think the data teams are. You know, I think you have to be at a certain point of maturity before you can really branch into the discussion, because if you're not, you can't let everybody go off and do their own thing. You need to have that kind of like centralized structure in place where at least everybody has to adhere to a core set of principles so that it just keeps it's running and running as expected.
Yeah, at some point, something has to be central, right? If we don't have a centralized data team, then we need principles that are centralized somehow, and those would be set up by management. And then maybe we should have a management mesh and decentralize that. That's an incredibly Swedish thought. And then we could have decentralized CEO, where everyone takes some CEO responsibilities. Not everyone knows how to be a CEO, obviously, but you know, we can still spread that out across the company. Everyone gets a pay raise. You know, we can take turns sitting in the CEO chair. It becomes a little bit silly when you start thinking about the decentralization that's going on right now, with the very tiny amount of preparation that seems to have occurred on the business side, and just transfer that to any other domain than data. It makes zero sense. If you said, oh, we're going to decentralize our management structure out into the teams fully, like no one will have centralized anything. The company is run together as this great commune. I mean, now I'm pro the idea suddenly because I said commune, but you get it. And then after the fact say, oh, what we need here are management contracts, like data contracts for this very silly idea. There's something about the data layer, I feel, where you can propose something and people would just go for it. Is that fair?
Yeah.
I think that is. I mean, I not to diminish data contracts. I think that's a wonderful principle that would help, that solves a lot of issues that we need to be buying into more. But yes, I feel like if you put the proper like message and deliver it correctly for a lot of the different terms, it can catch fire. And people will buy into it. I mean, you could and a lot of that has emerged. You know, you just have the right platform for it, and your message will spread really quickly.
But I'm curious here, and again, this is a question for both of you, since I do represent in these calls a little bit more the business side. But have you gotten like pressure or push from the business side of your organizations to have a different data architecture or org structure, like data mesh, for example? Where does that idea usually come from?
I mean, I think that has to come from a very, very high level, because, you
Yeah.
know, somebody could propose it, but it's got to be from the top level if it's actually going to be acted upon. So that, I mean, that's going to be a lot of change. I feel like, you know, sometimes, and this happens, you know, there's restructurings all the time in companies, especially in this day and age when, you know, a lot of companies are having to face these challenges of what changes they're going to make in order to stay alive during some of the challenges that the economy is facing.
Yeah.
you know, it really, it's a big thing because, you know, when you start to make these changes, you're going to figure out, oh, there's all these moving parts in this other side that we have to suddenly figure out how to integrate. And that becomes a huge challenge in of itself. So it's a tough problem to try to solve. You know, there's not an easy way to just back out of certain things and make it fit.
Yeah. What about you,
Yeah,
G? Have you had
yeah, to
business people
provide
say
it.
they want data mesh?
Yeah, I mean, I'll provide the answer from not Disney and Facebook, from the like small startup world. Definitely, there have been moments in my career lately where I felt like the CEO or CTO had been, you know, sitting up late reading LinkedIn and you know, comes into the office with this awesome great idea with a dubious value proposition. So
Okay.
yeah, for sure. But then I think if we're gonna flip the script a little bit and give some credit where credit is due, I also think that management has sometimes, when it comes to these buzzwords, been keeping people on focus. Like, it'll be sometimes a thing will be a passionate suggestion from a senior member of the technology side of things, and then management say, okay, you guys are the experts, and then 6 months later they say, hey, where is this thing, or how's it going, or no, don't switch, you know, horses now because we're doing this thing. So I've experienced both good and bad managerial pressure on architecture and very technical issues.
And sometimes, just coming from my management consultant, you know, experience, sometimes what you need is a change. Like, that is what you need, and then you decide to change the architecture or the team setup or something like that, and it's, you know, and that can be a good thing. Like, that can be a momentum generator, and like, oh, we're gonna do this and it's gonna be great, and value can come from that. But I want to touch on one more thing, and we're gonna, I think, wrap up soon. But maybe one more topic, at least for me. I don't know, Yi and Matt, if you have other things too, but Yi, when we were preparing a little bit for this discussion with Matt, we were talking about how data mesh might not necessarily be value focused. And what I mean when I say value focused is what does it actually bring to the business? Like, does it help the business make more money or cut down costs? We already said it doesn't help save costs. But there's this, I think, assumption, again, a little bit maybe an elephant in the room. There's this assumption that if we just have these domains and that are organized by functions or by systems that generate data, then everything would be so wonderful. But it's not tied to, oh, we are going to do demand prediction of how many products we're going to sell, and therefore we can optimize our stock inventory, and we are a retailer. Like, that's, you know, that's like a super use case specific thing, and then you can organize architecture around it. But that's not a part of data mesh. Or have I misunderstood the concept? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Sarah. I mean, you know, for starters, I don't think that a data mesh can necessarily save cost. It might help remove some deduplication that's in place, but it's not necessarily going to solve that problem. In fact, I could even argue that sometimes it increases cost, because what can happen is, you know, and this is another thing that would roll up into like a centralized platform team, is like having those cost controls in place, which is very, very relevant right now. FinOps is actually one of the other buzzwords that's kind of emerged in 2023. But you know, it definitely provides value. I mean, it helps really get some teams more up and running than they are currently, just because you know, you don't have to necessarily wait as much on something to be built, or you have to figure out how to integrate within that. But at the same time, there's definitely the challenges that come up along the way that make it difficult.
Yeah, I think data mesh has a pretty clear value proposition in and of itself. As Matt says, you know, it removes a bottleneck. It might it brings attention to the fact that the infrastructure is probably not bespoke. If you're publishing some data or producing some data or consuming some data, the infrastructure is probably not super special to your use case as a team. It can probably be shared across teams, and therefore teams should not be blocked by it. And teams should be very agile, and they should be able to produce what they need to produce when they need to produce it, and it moves, all the tasks come closer to the people who have the knowledge necessary to solve the tasks or the issues. So I think that's the value proposition in general. But what I don't really see is that value proposition being held up in discussions about data mesh. I don't see discussions of like, should we have a data mesh start with this particular value proposition? There's some sort of implicit good about it. I think as the idea matures, you can kind of look at pros and cons of any architecture, pros and cons, and we're still in a bit of a gold rush stage where we tend to not look at things in that light necessarily.
Exactly. And I think that's what I'm sensing. It's like, oh, data mesh is good, period. Like,
yeah. And in 2024, we'll have data, some other easily recognizable feature. We'll have a data tree or a data sky. I don't know, a data cloud,
data
something
tree
from nature.
That
data
sounds...
gators.
Data gators.
That's catchy. I could see that. I could definitely see that one taking off.
Yeah, I'm gonna put that as my LinkedIn byline. Data
yeah, exactly. Exactly. All right, we're gonna wrap up. Matt, do you have any final comments or things that were kind of hanging at the back of your mind that you want to share?
No, I think really we've touched upon a good message in this talk, and I think that's really just that, there's definitely a lot of good things to come out of these terms, not just data mesh, but a lot of others that are emerging. But at the end of the day, you definitely have to take the proper time to, reflect and plan for what that would actually look like. Because if you don't, then you're going to end up backtracking, and it's going to be a whole mess to unravel. And that's where, these things can really start to break down. So definitely with all the hype that emerges in the data space, because yeah, we're quick to latch onto it. I mean, I'm as guilty of that as anybody else, but always make sure that you put the proper time in to figure out what that's actually going to look like before you just take off and running with it.
That's a very
excellent, perfect, head on the nail, cherry on top ending message.
Yes, a perfect wrap up. I think from Jay and I, thank you so much, Matt, for taking the time. We really appreciate it, and we also think this was a great.
Oh, it was fun to be here. I've always been a fan of the events you guys put on in Sweden, but unfortunately, I don't think I'll be there anytime soon. So it's good to be able to do this at least virtually.
Yeah, very nice. And we'll come to the US soon, and then we can meet up.
I'd be more interested in Sweden, actually.
Oh, really?
But we'll try to make it work out somehow.
Yeah, you're welcome to come here as well. Let us know whenever.
Yeah, you can sleep on my couch. It's fine.
Nice. So that's a standing invitation. All right. Have a good rest of your day, both. I'll talk to you soon.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Yi. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much.
Bye.